I'm Dr. Michael Austin, and you're listening to Gospel Tangents.
Mormon History, Science, and Theology, and first daily Mormon History podcast. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to talk to Dr. Michael Austin. He's the author of The Testimony of Two Nations, How the Book of Mormon Reads and Rereads the Bible. So we're going to talk about his amazing new book and also find out a little bit more about academia. He's actually the provost at Snow College. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And a little bit of a crisis in higher education. Why are there fewer students? We'll find out more about that in our next conversation. I just want to mention one other thing. Michael, actually, I interviewed him a couple weeks ago, and he's been in and out of the hospital with pneumonia. So, prayers going to Michael. If you feel so inclined, pray and, give him some good vibes because we need to have him healthy again. So anyway, thanks, Michael, again for sitting with me and talking. And hopefully you're going to get better and stay out of the hospital. So now back to our conversation. Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to have the provost from Snow College here. And could you go ahead and tell us who you are and what city Snow College is in? Because a lot of people probably haven't heard of it.
Certainly. My name is Michael Austin, and I am the provost at Snow College, which is in Ephraim, Utah. In San Pete County. It's a 2-year junior college with a couple of 4-year programs and a lot of technical programs. And it is a place, I've been here about 4 months, and a place I'm very excited to be.
Nice. So I always like to get people's academic background. I was surprised to find out this is your third job as provost.
Yes.
So let's talk about your bachelor's, master's, PhD, and then give us a short work history.
So I received my bachelor's degree in English from BYU in 1990 in English. My master's degree in rhetoric and composition from BYU in 1992. And then my doctorate from the University of California at Santa Barbara. And that was in literature, and specifically the literature of the 17th and early 18th centuries.
Oh, wow. So then what did you do after that?
Then I spent the next 11 years teaching British literature and world literature at Shepherd College, which is in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, which is kind of in the extended Washington, D.C., Baltimore area.
Oh, okay.
And while there, I became an English department chair, and I became the graduate dean when Shepherd College became Shepherd University. And then in 2008, I applied for my first job as a provost, and I moved to Wichita, Kansas, to be the provost at Newman University.
Okay.
And I was there for 8 years. That's a Catholic school.
Okay.
And then I moved to the University of Evansville in Evansville, Indiana, which is a Methodist school.
Oh.
And so I have done both the Catholic and the Protestant educations and the Latter-day Saint education. And after 7 years there, both my wife and I wanted to come back to Utah. Karen for family reasons, and me largely for professional reasons. Most of the people I collaborate with are in Utah. Most of the places I publish are in Utah. Most of the conferences I go to are in Utah.
And you're all parochial schooled out now, I guess, huh?
Well, private education has one huge advantage, which is that you don't have a lot of regulation and you can do almost anything you want.
Oh.
It has one big disadvantage, which is nobody cares if you fail, and nobody is there to backstop you if you don't earn enough money through tuition or through your endowment.
Okay, so these have all been private schools up till now.
Shepherd College, Shepherd University was a public school in West Virginia.
Okay.
So this is the fourth college I've been affiliated with as either a professor or a provost. 2 of them have been private and 2 of them have been public.
Oh, very good. So can you talk a little bit more? We were talking a little bit off camera. There's I don't know if I should say crisis in higher education, but the enrollments are dropping. Can you talk about why that is?
So there are 2 trends that are behind the enrollment dropping. One of them we've been watching for years, and that is that the number of births in America went down after 2008, after the recession, and never came back up. So the number of college-eligible students has been going down and is right about to hit what we're calling the demographic cliff in 2025, when those numbers from high school, when those 18-year-olds, when the babies who weren't born in 2008 become 18-year-olds who don't exist. And that has been a challenge that we've all been preparing for. After COVID, college-going rates went down, and that took us by surprise. In January of 2020, about 71% of American high school students said that they wanted to go to college after they graduated from high school. 1 year later, after COVID, after almost a year of COVID, that number was 51%. Oh, wow. So there was a 20-point drop in the number of students who were interested in going to college. A lot of that has to do with COVID burnout. A lot of it has to do with very high salary rates in entry-level jobs that after COVID, after the country started getting back on track, we've had a labor shortage and salaries have been very high. So people who in jobs that used to make $7 or $8 an hour are making $16, $17 an hour now. What people aren't seeing...
So you don't need college then, right?
Well, what people aren't seeing is that inflation is eating into all of those gains. And within a couple of years, inflation will have completely erased the salary gains, because several years of high inflation have accompanied the growth in salaries, but people don't feel the effects until a little bit later.
Okay. Well, very interesting. Is it hitting private universities harder than public, or about the same?
It is hitting, price is the overwhelming consideration for most people going to college right now, and most parents sending kids to college. So private education, with its very high tuition, is finding that its discount rates are rising. So that if a college has a tuition of $50,000, they might only be getting 15% of that from most of their students, because their scholarships have to be so high. And it's very difficult to run a college on 15%, 15 cents to the dollar. Mm-hmm. So you're seeing a lot of really struggling public institutions, but you're seeing just some devastatingly struggling private higher education institutions right now.
Is that hitting the public schools as well?
To a lesser extent, because the public schools have a much lower tuition.
Okay.
And so the public schools are doing much, on average, and this is not true of every school, but public schools right now are doing better than most private schools, except for the very prestigious ones. Harvard is going to be fine. Swarthmore and Williams are going to be fine. They have such high endowments that they don't actually need students. Students are just a reason to dip into their endowment in order to give scholarships.
Oh, wow. Well, very interesting. Well, it's good to get that. We're not here to talk all about higher education, but it's interesting. You know, the funny thing is I work at UVU and Western Governors, and I always knew there was a provost, but I still don't really know. What does a provost do?
So a provost is the academic vice president. It's another name for the academic vice president. At most colleges, you have a president, then you have a vice president of finance, a vice president of enrollment management, a vice president of student affairs, and then a vice president of academic affairs. And the convention in most schools, not all school, is to call the vice president for academic affairs the provost.
Okay. I know some places do call it the academic VP.
Some call it the academic VP. Right now I have both titles. I am the provost and vice president for academic affairs.
Okay.
At the University of Evansville, I was just the executive vice president for academic affairs when I started. And then at Newman, I was just the provost.
Okay.
But it's the same position. It's the chief academic officer.
Okay. So Can you give us a few more details? What's your day-to-day like?
I meet with all of the deans and all of my other direct reports, which usually include the library director, the honors director, and I meet with a lot of those once a week and some of them once a month. I deal with a lot of accreditation issues. I make sure that our relationship with the Northwest Commission is solid and that we're doing all the things we need to do to remain accredited so that we can receive federal funds. I attend the president's cabinet meeting regularly with the other vice presidents. I do a lot of outreach to the school districts in our 6-county area here. I spend a lot of time meeting with USHE and with other vice presidents for academic affairs at other institutions, developing system-wide policies.
Okay.
And I hear a lot of complaints from people who aren't happy.
Very interesting. All right. Well, let's jump in. You've got a brand new book. Can you show it to the camera? Tell us what the name of it is.
So this is called The Testimony of Two Nations, How the Book of Mormon Reads and Rereads the Bible.
Okay. So I'm sure your English background is really helping to write that book.
Yes. This is a close reading of the Book of Mormon in a very specific context. And if I can kind of explain, the context problem in Book of Mormon studies is probably the most significant interpretive problem that we have, which is that there is not agreement about what the context of its creation was. Was it a Hebraic context post-Babylonian exile or pre-Babylonian exile? Was it a Mayan context? Was it a 19th century American context? And those all produce wildly different readings of the Book of Mormon. Mm-hmm. What I've tried to do in this book, and not because it's the only way to look at it, but I've tried to develop a different context. And to do that, I've looked back at the work of some of the biblical scholars of the late 1960s and early 1970s, especially a professor named Brevard Childs, who was at Yale. And this was at a time when the biblical context was highly disputed in Protestant seminaries. Do people look at the original texts, or do people look at the 20th century social context and look at the Bible as a way to solve social problems? And Childs said neither one of those is the best context. The best context for studying any particular part of the Bible is the entire Bible. So the canon is a context. And what a context means, I mean, when we say we're looking at the context in any kind of interpretive exercise, context means what other books do you read in order to try to understand the book you're trying to interpret? Do we read 19th century novels to try to understand the Book of Mormon? Do we read Hebraic and ancient Near Eastern manuscripts to try to understand it? You know, what is the other body of text that we read? And what Child says is that for the Bible, every book in the Bible has more to do with every other book in the Bible than it does with any book that's not in that canon.
Okay.
And you know, the Christian Bible is itself the process of a very, very rigorous but also very torturous interpretive process where over 2,000 years, almost everything in the Old Testament has been reframed as something that is predictive of Christ, as a type.
For Christianity.
So you have, take the Adam and Eve story.
Yeah.
If you just read the book of Genesis without any context, that's a trickster story. That's a story of a talking animal who tricks God and tricks people and sets in motion a plot that creates chaos where there was once stability, but also where there was lack of movement. If you look at that from a Jewish perspective, you have a talking snake. You do not have Satan. Satan kind of was put into the Christian context, but if you look at this from a Jewish story, this is this is just a story of disobedience that really becomes a metaphor for the disobedience of the Israelites that precipitated the conquest of Babylon. If you look at it, reading the book of Revelation and the book of Luke and other Christian contexts, other Christian texts, then that serpent becomes Satan, and this becomes the first act in a drama of salvation, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at it from the Book of Mormon context, if you add the Book of Mormon into it, it becomes not a fall, but a necessary choice,
Right.
In which Adam and Eve make the decision that they're going to partake of the fruit and leave Eden because that's the only way that human beings can get born. And you only get that if you add the Book of Mormon into the mix. So depending on the books I read it against, that story means 4 completely different things. So what this book does is it tries, it makes the argument that the context of the Book of Mormon is the context of the Bible and the Book of Mormon together. And in order to create a book that fits in with the Bible and the Book of Mormon, in with the Old and the New Testaments, the Book of Mormon has to do many of the same kinds of interpretive maneuvers retroactively that the New Testament does in order to map itself onto the Old Testament.
Okay. Such as with the New Testament, they're going to go back to Isaiah and say, well, this is really referencing Christ. Is that
Yes.
what you're talking about?
Yeah, there is nothing in Isaiah that any Jewish person would read and say this represents Christ. That's, it means something completely different if you don't have the Gospels as part of your context of interpretation.
Okay. So so you're looking at the Book of Mormon compared to the Bible as the New Testament compared to the Old Testament.
That's a rough equivalency, but yes, I'm saying that the Book of Mormon creates a restoration canon out of the Christian Bible in ways that are very similar to the way that the New Testament created the Christian canon out of itself and the Hebrew Bible.
Okay.
The other example we have of this in Western literature is the way that Virgil created a new canon out of the Homeric epics and the Aeneid that he was writing. So Virgil went back in and interpolated the story, the founding of Rome, into the story of the fall of Troy.
Okay.
And in doing so, he imported all of the Greek mythology into Roman mythology. And the Book of Mormon incorporates all of the Christian stories into itself, and it creates this new canon. We'll call it the Restoration Canon, out of the Bible, both Testaments, and itself.
Okay. So your point of view is we're looking at this not from a historical, not from a Jewish perspective, not that there's anything wrong with those,
Right.
but it's just a different way to look at the Book of Mormon.
Right. It says that for any book in the Book of Mormon, any part of the Book of Mormon, the most relevant context are the books of the Bible and the other books of the Book of Mormon. So if we want to understand the way that certain symbols work, certain types work, we want to set the stories of the Book of Mormon against the stories of the Bible. And this works on a narrative level. I'm a narrative critic. So this is working on narrative more than on just straight instructional text.
So does it matter to you whether the Book of Mormon is historical? Did it take place in Malaysia, South America, Malay?
That's actually a harder question than it sounds.
Okay.
Because from textually interpreting the Book of Mormon, there's nothing about it that needs to be in the New World, that needs to be part of any historical context. It's a text. Texts can't prove their own historicity. So in just interpreting the text along with the Bible, it is not particularly relevant whether or not it was a historical text or a product of the imagination. However, the Restoration canon also includes and has canonized the Joseph Smith history story. And so once you add that into the mix, then the historicity does become part of the canonical context of interpretation.
Okay.
Not because of the text itself, but because of the canonization of that story. So at a minimum, you have to at least accept, I think, in order to do canonical interpretation, that there was somebody named Moroni who did something.
Okay.
Because
but you don't care where he lived.
Well, you don't have to say that he got it all right.
Okay.
You look at just the way that 1,000 years of any civilization unfolds, the time from Nephi to Moroni, the idea that Mormon and Moroni were getting everything right about the time of Nephi or the time of Alma really goes against how we know history works.
Okay. Does that work the same way for the Bible as well? Does Job have to be a literal person, or Adam and Eve, or Moses, or Abraham?
No, not at all. I don't think any of the stories of the Old Testament need to be historical in order to interpret them.
Okay.
But the New Testament does treat some of these stories as historical, and that becomes part of the canonical context. So you don't have to believe that Job was historical, which I don't. I mean, I did write a whole book on Job and made the argument that this was a folk tale that was repurposed within a Hebrew context. But you do have to acknowledge that some of the writers of the New Testament did think Job was real.
Okay.
And that does become part of how you read their texts.
Okay. Well, very interesting. So is going to the literalists, you don't really care whether either the Bible or the Book of Mormon is literal as far as your interpretation?
Correct. I don't think that it's necessary to issue a ruling on historicity in order to interpret the text the way that I'm trying to interpret the text.
Okay. Because I know there's an example where people will say, and I think even President Kimball said, was it Les Miserables, that he said that's almost scripture. Can a person take Lord of the Rings or Les Mis or something like that and get the same spiritual insights as they could with the Bible or the Book of Mormon?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course. Now, the canonical context of interpretation simply presumes that certain texts have been accepted as spiritually authoritative by certain communities.
Okay.
So we are looking at why these books are important to certain communities. And so in that sense, they are more connected to each other than to Les Mis or The Lord of the Rings or The Little Engine That Could.
Okay.
Which doesn't mean that these things can't have valuable spiritual insights. But when we interpret the texts of a canon, we have to look first to other texts in the same canon in order to provide the grounding for the interpretation, using the method that I'm suggesting here.
Very good. Interesting. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Michael Austin. He's the author of The Testimony of Two Nations, How the Book of Mormon Reads and Rereads the Bible. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about unreliable narrators in the Book of Mormon.
I think Alma is a very unreliable narrator.
Okay.
I mean, here you have Alma the Younger particularly. Here you have one person who ended up being the chief judge, so the political leader, and the head of the church, the religious leader, and then he spends like 30 chapters complaining that everybody is oppressing him when he's ended up with all of the power in this community.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt, so check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.